Okay, welcome again to the webinar event entitled Information Security Practices and Trend in Agile Enterprises. This event is organized as a pre-conference webinar for the 37th Annual Software Quality Conference, Pacific Northwest Software Quality Conference. As you know, this event is going to take place on October 14th through the 16th in Portland. And this event is going to be on the subject of information security, and information security, of course, is a subject of great importance in IT today. We have some interesting speakers and panelists, and so I'm Ying-Ki Kwong, your moderator today for this event. I work for the state of Oregon, program manager for the statewide QA program. I have an interest in quality and risk management and has done some papers in these subject matters over the years for PNSQC. I'm interested in enterprise IT projects and complex systems and work with some local nonprofits. A couple of house rules about this event, the most important one being participants, except for the panelists and myself, your mics will be muted. And audience is encouraged to send in questions through the chat tool of Zoom. We will try to get to the questions, and to the extent they relate to some of the main topics area, I might group them and potentially reword the question in a way that enable better fit into the different parts of the webinar event. This is being recorded, so there will be the opportunities for subsequent viewing of the webinar, as well as sharing of information about this event with your colleagues if you turn out to find this helpful. A few words about the PNSQC organization. This is the 37th annual event. PNSQC is the oldest software quality conference in North America. It's always held in Portland. It's a non-profit organization based in Oregon. And over the years, it's also done good work providing talks and other software quality related events to local organization, including events for the state of Oregon. I find the interaction with the conference and its management very beneficial, and the conference look forward to bring forth a whole range of topics and speakers in many different areas of current interest in software engineering, software quality, and really businesses that use quality to enable process improvements and the like. All the papers published in the PNSQC proceedings and are presented at the conference would be peer reviewed, as those of us that gone through the review process know it's pretty rigorous, going through multiple drafts. So I think PNSQC, the conference, sort of drink its own Kool-Aid when it comes to iterative development. So I mentioned today's event is going to be recorded and will be made available on YouTube and other channels. Folks are encouraged to talk about PNSQC, tell their colleagues about it, and to register. There's an early bird rate that will expire on September 20th. Substantial discounts can be made available if registered before that date, and also there would be group discount for groups with 4 or more people. This year, we're going to organize a enterprise IT forum. I think it's going to end up called Enterprise IT Quality Forum. It'll cover a range of topics, and these topics will be in different areas. We did a survey, and the survey results pretty much in line with expectation. Agile and DevOps are hot topics, as is security, and certain topics relating to requirements gathering and things of that sort. So we will try to hold these forums in the form of focused discussions. And if you're interested in how the relative timing of the forum is like, you're welcome to go to the PNSQC website and look under Conference at a Glance. The overall program has been posted, and the At a Glance webpage is a good way to see kind of the big picture of the conference in terms of all the different events. We have 3 panelists today. John Civetko is going to be one of our panelists. He's the principal of Tech Associates, and he's worked with many different companies and government agencies, having worked in many areas of system engineering, product and program management, and in management consulting. John has worked with a number of states throughout the US, and I have direct experience working with John in the state of Oregon. FEMA is one of our expert developers as well as managers of startups in the information security field. FEMA has worked for Intel, Cisco's, and multiple startups. He's developed a variety of secure softwares, including more recently solutions around passwordless authentication and point-of-sale friendly blockchain type platforms. Brian Myers, who's doing a paper this year currently with WebMD. Brian has a long history of teaching software classes as well as working in software development and more recently in information security related fields. We're very lucky to have these folks participating today. The format today is going to be through 4 high-level questions. The first question is going to be, why are there so many security breaches like Capital One? Probably some of you know that some 100 million individuals' personal information were exposed. And the way we're going to do this is each questions will be asked. Our panelists will address each of these questions. Each person will be given about 3.5 minutes. We'll have a warning beep around 3 minutes. And we're going to start this process, in kind of a round robin. We're going to start with John and then Dima and then Brian. So without further ado, John, why don't you give it the first stab?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ying. I appreciate it. And I'd like to say welcome to all the attendees. So the question, the first general question is why there's so many breaches like Capital One, and that's an extremely broad question, obviously, and there's probably many different reasons why there are so many breaches in general. I was looking today at FBI's site and where they attribute most of the breaches to, and 50% they attribute to hacking. The next 30% are attributed to malware. And on these very large systems, it's very difficult to manage a lot of different things, especially patch management. I was working with a client today who is moving from a very vertical-oriented system, Microsoft, throughout their system, to a more dynamic system that has, Oracle, Apache, many different components from many different vendors, and it's very difficult to keep that patching level up on those type of systems, and especially if you want to try to do it in any time frame. Typically, they started out at 3 weeks to patch, and some of these systems are, very vast, and you could see why it would take so long to put one patch through the system. And so, they try to drive down to a week or less. And even then, that's a potential problem because they could easily have, people monitoring their systems and just wait, laying in wait for the right opportunity. So there are those concerns. Other concerns are just sloppiness in general. A lot of times they do meet compliance for different systems, but they really don't live their security prowess. They don't have a very good security posture. And so you'll see a lot of organizations will do just the bare minimum. And in the sense of security by law, they're only having to do what is reasonable. And so that leads for a very wide interpretation as to what is necessary from the standpoint of the compliance, the law, and also for protection of people's data. So there's many different reasons why that happens. And even in different systems, a lot of times people think that there's standards across the board for every component of security, but they can vary greatly. And depending on the type of system you're in, you could be under a lot of regulatory compliance, and then you also may not be under any regulatory compliance. And so there's different levels depending on the environment that you're in, whether you're in banking or whether you're in e-commerce, et cetera. And so those different systems often, will be subject to certain elements that can be exploited, over time.
Thanks, John. Dima, why don't you take the next step?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So just to start it off and to remind everyone, the biggest reason that there are so many breaches is the incentives that is there. Right, so the cost of the record on the black market goes from anywhere from 10 cents a record to hundreds of dollars per record to thousands of dollars per record. So there's a lot of incentive built in for people to go after the data, for perpetrators to go after the data. And like John said, there are so many vectors of attack to get at the system, going after the file level, going after databases, going after man-in-the-middle attacks, the network layer, social engineering, going after the credentials, via phishing attacks or social engineering. Just so many attack vectors that it's very, everybody knows it's impossible to get 100% on the security side. And given the tools that the hackers have today, and given the number of interfaces that each system has, systems are complex. There are APIs all over the place. The database is exposed on many sides. The file systems are exposed on many sides. The web interfaces are exposed on many sides through APIs and whatnot. So just the sheer number of vectors provides unlimited opportunities for attackers to come in, and the incentive is there for them to abuse it and leverage it. So yeah, it comes down to all the protections that need to be in place and de-incentivizing as much as possible, and also providing the right data security governance frameworks as one of the main factors in getting the incentives down and getting the data to a point where it's not all that useful, even if the attackers do get at it.
Great. Thank you very much, Dima. Brian, what's your take? Brian, possibly your phone is muted.
Am I still muted there? Is that better?
You're good. Good now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for having me. I'm sorry about that little mistake there. I was going to begin by enumerating all the different kinds of ways that attacks could occur, but John and Dima have done that very well. I'll just summarize by saying it's common to observe that the attackers are at an advantage here because the defenders have many vectors to block. Every incoming phishing email, every server that could be misconfigured, every buffer overflow that could occur in code. The attackers just need to find a couple that are a couple of holes that are open, and they get in, and that's in some sense an easier job. I was going to say I don't disagree with Dima that incentives are the core of the problem. He also touched on what I was going to mention first, which is just the complexity of the systems that we're trying to defend. Coding creates complex systems of logical abstractions that frequently exhibit behaviors no one intended, and they run on hardware that's complex. Hardening servers is a skill of its own. Network architecture has plenty of room for errors. Tracking and patching all your third-party code is hard. And then on top of that, you probably have legacy code if you've been around long enough, and that's a new layer of complexity. Stuff, you know, maybe on servers that nobody even remembers how to build anymore, and patching those is hard. So if complexity is the problem, and if I'm going to skip over that since everybody else has already done good justice to that, I thought I might just ask, what can we do to address complexity? How can we mitigate that? If there are ways to de-incentivize, as Dima suggested, that would be good. And then if there are ways to simplify the systems or our management of the systems, that may also help. So automating as much as you can is certainly a good simplification, particularly in testing, in monitoring and alerts. Using tools that integrate systems for you. So here, a SIM system, a security information event management system like Splunk or ELK, can greatly simplify your job when you're trying to monitor what's going on or forensically determine what happened when. Reducing your tech debt wherever possible so that you don't have cruft in the code base that you have to remember how to work on. Sunsetting projects and ripping out code that is no longer needed is a good way to reduce your attack surface, as is purging data once its retention period is gone. Anything you can do to simplify what you're defending is a help. I guess that's my answer.
Thanks. There's a kind of a related question coming in, and maybe more for Brian. The question goes along the line of, you know, a lot of people are concerned about banking-related type information being stolen. Are there particular challenges where medical or healthcare-related information is concerned?
Well, the biggest thing that's different from the point of view of running a security program, I mean, every security program is different depending on what it's defending. So if you have health claims data about patients, that's really valuable identity fraud stuff, because unlike a credit card number, your health history can't be disowned or blocked. You will always have had that operation last year. You will always have whatever condition, if it's a permanent condition, and you can't expunge that from your record or make it not true. It can also be used for medical fraud. So the fact that you have healthcare data, it certainly ups the ante and requires you to do more than you might if you had less sensitive data. Is that addressing the question?
Yeah, I think so. John, you also work quite a bit in healthcare-related fields. Do you think there's something special about healthcare when it comes to security concerns?
Well, that is a good question, and really it goes back to kind of what Dima was saying from my perspective. How can you monetize, you know, hackers want to monetize the information that they get. And so a number of ways that they could monetize the privacy information is through extortion of the agency that they're taking it from. They could, as Brian says, commit health fraud, maybe billing certain insurance companies under people's names, etc. And those are very valid, ways for hackers to make money off of this. But in banking, it's a little different in the sense that, if you hit one bank, you basically kind of capture the client base in that bank, and so it is somewhat limited in a sense. And the same with healthcare records. But the one that really kind of gets my crawl is the Equifax breach, because that breach has a long tail to it. Because as most people have to use Equifax for some type of credit, some type of financial component. And they have, not only social security numbers, date of birth, they also have, the loan that you're working with, all the banks that you're working with. And so if they get access to that data, people can then sell that data. And we're seeing that kind of crop up right now across the U.S. There's a pretty good scam going on across the banks, and I don't want to kind of go over here, but I can talk about that on a subsequent question.
Great. Dima, any thought on kind of distinction or differentiation between banking, health, and other types of data? Dima, did you mute your phone?
I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I started saying that healthcare data actually happens to be the most valuable of them all, and that's the one that's pushing into thousands of dollars, exactly for the reasons that John mentioned, is committing a fraud, healthcare fraud, billing Medicare perhaps for wrongful claims, and that's the moneymaker for a lot of these fraudsters. So it's the most valuable data they can get their hands on, and the more of that data that the perpetrators, attackers can have, the better off they are in figuring out how to exploit it. And so banking data has different implications and different usages of it. So if the attacker is able to complete a picture puzzle of puzzle together all the data on the subject, it becomes more and more valuable. So the more you know about the person all around, from the address perspective, phone numbers, for Social Security, obviously, medical history, banking status. If somebody knows that someone has millions of dollars in their bank account, obviously they become much more lucrative of a target. So the more you know about the subject, the more valuable the data is. So that to me is the biggest difference than the different systems they go after, is being able to get the type of data that completes the picture and fetches them the most money for the data they collected.
Thank you very much. Let me move on to the next question. What is the right balance between security and meeting business need? Our program chair for PNSQC suggested kind of an alternate way to put this question, and that is if there were 80-20 rule about information security and protecting oneself against vulnerability, how do you get to that 80? Let's start with John again.
Sure. So again, it depends on the system that you're trying to protect, right? I mean, you'll be much more conservative if you're dealing with a bank or healthcare than you would be if you were, a Yahoo, or you were just doing a dating website or something like that. And so, depending on where you fall in that spectrum, will typically help you figure out how much business versus security. Because in general, we're always balancing business and security, and depending on, again, where you go, you'll have to understand their business. As a consultant, you have to understand their business, and then you can kind of get your head around where they need to fall with security. But back to my other thing that I mentioned earlier about, the Equifax. So currently there's a scam going on across the country against credit unions and banks. And the way it works is very interesting. And as Dima said, it's a puzzle, and they're just trying to find that one last piece of the puzzle. So I have a friend that got caught up in the scam just recently, 2 weeks ago. And basically what they do is they spoof your phone, the bank's phone number, and a text. And so it says that you've had a fraud alert on your account, and please press the text, and then the scammer then spoofs the bank's phone number and calls you directly with the caller ID on the phone. And so they're really instilling a lot of confidence, right? That's part of the plan. As soon as they get you on the phone, they tell you, of course, they put the fear of God into you that your system is being hacked. Somebody's trying to charge $2,000 to a Costco or whatever. And they want to go in and they want to reset your account right away. And so all they ask is for your username. You give them your username, and then they say, okay, we're going to go ahead and reset your account. And as soon as we're done, we want you to reset your account, please, please reset your account. And so the people go in and they reset their password. And then everybody is fine, and they say, you'll receive a new debit card in 2 days. Well, come to find out that in the password reset procedure, in some of these cases, all you need is 3 components. You need the date of birth, the Social Security, and the username of the account. And so they have all that information now. Even though you resetted your account, they have all that information, which means that they can, at their leisure, go in and reset your account and begin the process of taking money. And so what they did in his case was that they waited till the evening, because every time they reset the password, an email shoots out to the person. They went in, they reset the password, and then they immediately did a transfer on Zelle. And so, in this case, there are many different issues here. The bank didn't have, its phones protected, etc. But there's also this element of new technology. And so the banks are rushing to put Zelle into the system, and it is maybe, they're doing it too aggressively. They should take some more time to figure out what the security implications are. But if you think about this scam, these hackers had, the person's name, person's phone number, the bank that they were banking at, their date of birth, their Social Security number, and the ability to figure out that whole puzzle and just have one more component. And so the fact that this is happening over many different banks across the country probably means that this data has come from a very broad source, again, like the Equifax.
Thank you very much. Dima is next.
Yeah, so if you look at this 80-20 as what kind of things you can do security-wise to protect the data and the perimeter, right? So you can do it comes down to data security versus threat prevention and detection versus pen testing and whatnot. So to me, data security is the 80 of that 80-20. Obviously, everything else is important, and some of it also might fall into 80. But data security is paramount. If you can depersonalize the data, if you can, if you can follow GDPR-like frameworks, data security frameworks, and fragment the data in a way where the perpetrators, attackers don't get access at all the data at once, and they can't piece it together. That in my mind is the 80 of the 80-20, or maybe at least 60. And then obviously data, the threat prevention and protection and pen testing is very important as well.
Thank you very much. Brian?
Yeah, I'll start by agreeing with both John and Dima about the problem being a trade-off that's particular to each business. I think of it as going into battle and trying to figure out what armor to wear. If you go into battle in full suit of plate armor and a tower shield, you're probably safe from pretty much most arrows that are going to go your way, but you might be moving too slowly to damage the enemy. And so you have to judge, in order to figure what the 80% is, you have to judge very carefully what tactics you're likely to encounter and what exactly it is you need to defend. So it's hard to give a general answer that will fit all businesses. That said, I tried to think what an answer might be. I mean, the minimum, John mentioned the bare minimum that many people do, would probably be meeting whatever your regulatory compliance requirements are, which vary from industry to industry, and your contractual obligations. You don't really have a choice. You have to do those things. But that does not get you the 80%, certainly does not. You also want to do, I'm sure you do, the right thing to protect your customers, and determining that what that is hard. And legal standard, which John mentioned earlier, is due diligence or due care. What would a reasonable, a prudent person do? If something goes wrong and you're in court and someone is explaining what risks your company faced and you're explaining what you actually did, would that look reasonable to people? So in order to get to a point where you're consistently doing reasonable things, I would suggest what I think you have to do is be sure that the senior management in your company understands your information security program and supports and participates it, that they cultivate a corporate culture that conceives as employees, all employees as security practitioners, and this is the point I'll dwell on, you need to systematically identify and manage risk. That's the core of it, and much of the rest flows from that. You have to practice good risk management, which is simply, at the high level, identifying all the security risks that your business might face, prioritizing them, and figuring out reasonable mitigations for the most important ones first, and then working through that and being sure with management support that you get the resources for the company to address the highest risks systematically. That's the core of what I think would give most people a basis for arguing they were doing something reasonable. That's my answer.
Thank you very much. I have kind of a related question. This time must be from one of our government colleagues. And again, I guess this time I'll start with John and perhaps Dima. When it comes to government-related type applications, is there a sense in which that balance needs to be done a little bit differently?
I think it is done differently, and for different reasons. I mean, that's a very good question. The government relies heavily on regulatory compliance. You know, if they're told to do something 7 times out of 10, they will do it. Although, you know, they are kind of hard pressed on funds, obviously, and they really don't have I don't want to paint too broad of a picture, but a lot of times the agencies that they work in really aren't people that they socialize with all the time, and so they have sometimes they have a disconnection to their client, and so we may think that, you know, a Medicaid system or a you know, welfare system or something, they had a breach of 1 million people or whatever, but we don't necessarily connect that to our personal lives. You know, like I mentioned earlier, when my friend had the scam, the bank scam, that really connected to my life. Also because I have a banking account, and, you know, not necessarily with his bank, but with other banks, and so I do similar type work as he does. So there is this kind of disconnection, and I'm not sure exactly where that comes from, but the other thing that I was talking about to another friend of mine was about a breach in one of the state agencies. And she kind of perked up because she had utilized those services of that state agency. And so for her, it really hit home, but for me, it didn't, because I don't know, I don't really have a connection into that system. And so then I began to think of it even more. And two things popped up. In the particular system that they you know, had the breach in, there was not only you know, a superset of clients, but they had a very subset, which is with abuse victims. And oftentimes those people are heavily protected in these systems. And people really don't think about, okay, we had a breach of the system, but the reality is in that system, there may be a subset of 10 or 15% of people that are at physical danger if that information gets out. So in general, I think that there is a different standard for sure, but that standard is usually pressed upon the state and federal agencies, you know, by federal partners, or, you know, by politicians or whatever. They don't have an inherent reason to do certain things, in the sense that if they lose all their money in their bank, say they were a bank, a federal agency or whatever, and they lost all the money in the bank, they may not go out of business. They may just say, okay, you know, we screwed up and we have to continue on. Whereas if a bank gets hacked, you know, they may lose their brand and they may lose their money. It may have a direct effect in a very short period of time on their business.
Thanks. I think, Dima, you also work with some government organizations. What do you think about this in terms of this balance being potentially different in government versus private sector.
Yeah, I kind of want to build on what John already said and Brian mentioned before him. I think it comes down to risk management, and different agencies and different entities have different risk stacking. Where if it's Equifax, it may be about data. If it's a bank, it may be about financial resources they've lost, and they can mitigate those risks. When it comes down to public sector, it's a different ball game because it now becomes public safety issue. That may be the number one concern. It could be messing around with different public programs like Social Security or other programs that people rely on. So the impact is quite different, and risk stacking could be quite different from depending on the organization and what they're trying to protect, and the type of outcomes that those risks could provide. So that's I think there's a huge difference in risk stacking in all those cases, and government is obviously has some very important resources to protect, and important systems to protect, and because it's public safety related and public health related, it's just the value goes up so dramatically.
Thank you for that. Brian, any thoughts?
No, you're right. I do not have experience working in the government regulated industries.
No problem. Thank you very much. It's time to move on to the next question. This one may be very interesting to our technologists, developers, and testers. And the question is there a sense that the frequent software releases in Agile and DevOps may be responsible for some of these security problems? Let's start with John.
And Dima and Brian might be better suited to answer this question more in depth, but in general, so there are pros and cons to everything, right? And so the pro with Agile is that there is potentially a much better design. There's much more frequent releases. You get more value out of your software. And DevOps is all about pushing it out as fast as possible. And I was watching a video a couple weeks back about, I think it was Capital One. They had their architect up, and he was talking about primarily DevOps, and he wanted to push code out very fast. But he had to deal with the compliance personnel in the organization. You just can't put code out without having it go through certain checks. And so they worked together very effectively to automate a lot of the compliance components. So they may not have gotten it out, a release every day or a release every week, but they had improved the process of pushing the code out in still a secure and reliable manner. And I thought that was a really good study on that. Agile, again, some of this depends on the industry that you're in, right? If you're in not a Facebook, but if you're in a very benign industry, pushing out a lot of code in an agile fashion, may be just fine. But when you're in a more of a regulated environment, whether it be banking or insurance or whatever, you have to have a little bit more care. And you can still use Agile. There's no issue with that. It's just the thought process of how fast you push it out and how much you want to test it before you do push it out. So, not saying that Agile is bad. I'm just saying that it may have to be used for certain pieces, but in the release component, there may be a much longer testing time than normal Agile proponents would like.
Thank you. Why don't we go to Dima?
Yeah, so I completely agree with John. Every code push that you have presents a risk that either a new hosts have opened up or it's some of the old hosts may have reopened. And the more frequently you push, obviously you can't carry out a full pen test, for example, on every push, depending how frequently you push out the releases. If you're Facebook and you push out releases twice a day, and lucky for them, they're a website and they have lots of monitoring tools and ton of data to go on, and the vectors are limited. But yeah, the more frequently you push it out, the less time you have to test it, and it does create opportunities for new risks to open up. So it has to be a balance. And I haven't seen, having worked in software development for a long time, I haven't seen the security risks being identified by developers as part of the process on a regular basis. Some may try, some organizations may try, but that rarely becomes a standard in the organization. So definitely one of the weaknesses that dev organizations face is security as an afterthought. Yeah, so it does have to be taken into consideration on the continuous integration efforts and the frequent releases. Definitely some work to do there in a lot of organizations, if not most.
Thank you. Brian, it's your turn.
Yeah, this is interesting. We do all have different experiences, though I think we all completely agree on the main points. Agile and DevOps are certainly not the right thing for all situations, and there absolutely has to be a balance, and it's hard to get right. My short answer to this question is no. Agile and DevOps are not responsible for increased security problems, and the nuance would be, if they are, it's only to the extent they're not done well, and then the problem is not necessarily with the process, but with the execution of it. I was at WebMD about 10 years ago, I've been here since then, when they moved from a waterfall delivery process to an agile delivery process, from 3 releases a year to releasing every other week. And now we are updating much more often than that. And when we made that transition, certainly there was a lot of anxiety about whether we would be able to, what kinds of problems we would have when we made releases much more frequently, with less preparation time, less test time, less time devoted to designing each thing. And there is a plus side to that. The plus side is the changes that can be made in a short time are much smaller changes. They're easier to understand. They make fewer changes in the entire code base, and they are less risky. So from a security point of view, it is easier to assess in some ways the small changes that come with an Agile or even a DevOps model. Of course, with power comes responsibility, and if you're going to make small cross-functional teams that are empowered to achieve their own success, you're giving them the ability to make decisions about what the product's going to be like, for example, about what the requirements should be. And DevOps adds to that the need for the teams, and Dima touched on this, for the teams themselves to take on some of the security responsibility. And that is certainly hard, and there are companies with cultures where that would not be a good fit and probably would not work at all. I would say that the shift to, well, let me take a step back. DevOps, if it actually meets a business need, is something that security should support. It's the job of information security in a large degree, at least as conceived in the private sector, to enable the business to do what it needs to do in a safe way. And there are safe ways to do the DevOps. That's been proven. I was reading just the other day, for example, that Bank of America took some group onto DevOps, and they cited a 6-fold reduction in production defects after they went onto DevOps. And that was at a bank. Maybe that was a special team. I don't know that that was the whole bank. But what you need to do with DevOps is empower the teams, shift the culture from having security be the people who review and approve changes to having the teams be capable of reviewing and approving their own changes, at least to a large degree. And the kinds of practices that make that possible to consider are things like training, giving them more security-related training, helping them distinguish between relatively safe changes and riskier changes, and creating perhaps checklists that teams themselves can work through in order to determine that they can approve themselves a small change they're making, streamlining the review process for more significant changes, putting security use cases in automatic test suites, relying heavily on automatic vulnerability scanning of various kinds, establishing patterns for common situations like identity and privileges and encryption and authentication secrets so that those don't have to be reinvented each time. And of course, relying on automated monitoring and SecOps. Those are the kinds of changes you have to make for DevOps to work.
Great, thank you very much. I have a comment from a member of the audience, and it says the following: there's always the risk in a waterfall project that the security isn't tested until the end of the project when it's too late to fix.
Absolutely.
Would it be better kind of to adopt a sort of agile methodology in which you push new code into a safe environment and still have a chance to verify the security of the data? So this is a very interesting question, probably very dear to developers. So I will go through the round robin again. I'll start with John.
Yeah, again, there's pros and cons to both. I do think that and as Brian said and as Nima said, it really depends if you do Agile and DevOps really well. I mean, if your organization has a culture of real Agile and real DevOps, then and security, then this probably is a non-issue. But what I have seen in many places that I go is that that is not the case, and so there is an opportunity for letting things pass through. So again, it really depends on where you are and what you're doing. One of the things I would say in the case of like the bank issue that I talked about before was that is anytime a new product is added, a new component, those are the times of the greatest risk. And so whether you use waterfall or agile, you'll want to make sure that in those times when you're under pressure to get the first release out, hopefully you can take a breath either before you release or right after you release and circle back around to make sure that your systems are secure.
Great. Dima?
Yeah, thinking how to answer that. So it might be one of those things, the ounce of prevention versus pound of cure type of thing. With waterfall, if you have an independent party, for example, stepping in once the product is done to audit security, it might be too much and too late to fix it, right? So the trick is to get the threat, identify the threats early on in the process. So to have a resource, either the team itself or dedicated resources looking for those threats ahead of time. And if you can do it properly and timely, then you can speed up the development cycles. And like Brian was saying, if you can do, there's limited scope changes on smaller releases. So if you can identify the threat opportunities much more easily, assuming that you have the proper resources doing that, either on staff or on the team itself. So yeah, so it's if it's done right, then Agile could provide a better model for doing it. But as far as independent audits, the waterfall is still probably the only model that can support those without much heft.
Great. Brian?
The suggestion from the questioner is that in an agile release cycle, couldn't you push to a safe environment and verify the security of the data there? That was part of the question. Yes, and in fact, there's no reason that shouldn't be a standard part of any agile, security aside. It is where I work. Yes, that's absolutely a good idea, and you absolutely want to catch anything you can before it gets to production by whatever means, automated or manual, whatever it takes. I'd also observe that in both waterfall and agile, it is an excellent idea for different reasons, for related reasons, for security to be involved in early planning stages of any change or any significant change. In waterfall, it doesn't work unless you plan what the security requirements are in advance and have most of that anticipated and built into the design. That's what's expected. You don't want to find a whole bunch of stuff wrong you have to change at the end that you can only discover when you test it on staging after it's already built. So you absolutely have to include security with all the requirements up front. And in Agile, it's similar. Particularly in DevOps, I mean, you want to catch things. If things are going to go up fast, they better be built right to start with. That means the right conversations have to have occurred for the risks to have been identified and some mitigation to have been at least accounted for and designed. Maybe in testing you discover it didn't work right and there's a change to make. That might be a smaller change than adding a mitigation where the need for one wasn't even identified up front.
Great, thank you very much. Now we move on to this forward-looking question. What is the next big thing in security? Let's start with John.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief because I know we're coming up to the hour, but so I'm going to give a paper at PNSQC on blockchain. So obviously I think blockchain is an answer to the question. But more pressingly, I think that there's a lot of point solutions for many different areas. And so what I'm beginning to see more and more of and push more and more of is true external independent penetration testing. I spent the summer trying to convince a state agency that by law they're required to do penetration testing, and they still didn't want to do it. So, this is one of the hardest things to sell organizations on, is doing real penetration testing. They just don't see the value. But the reality is, the technicians come in and do layered security, right? But they really never look how somebody can, snake through those layers to get to the data inside. And so I think, personally, I think that is probably the next big push for a lot of organizations in general.
Great. Dima?
Yeah, so having spent the last couple of years in blockchain, I'm a little bit biased towards a specific trend, which is decentralization. Because no matter how good you get at fighting off the threats, if you have a big bulk of data sitting on one server, if it's a pot of gold, you're going to have people taking cracks at it all the time. And like Brian was saying before, it only takes one little crack to get at the data. So the only way to mitigate that really is to push the data out to the edges as much as possible. So there's no single bolt sitting there in the middle, attracting all the incentivizing the attackers to go after. So in my mind, that's the biggest trend that's coming is decentralization as much as possible, and having people be responsible for their own data as much as possible. And there's obviously gradations of that, and you can have some hybrid approaches, but yeah, I'd say decentralization.
Great. Brian?
Those are excellent answers. I knew that I didn't know how to predict what the next big thing would be, so I instead asked myself, what would I like the next big thing to be? And I came up with two answers. Before I say what the first one is, let me remind you that it's a well-known fact we have a workforce shortage in information security. There are lots of studies about this. Year after year, there are more and more unfilled jobs. It can take 6 months to fill a job. Estimates vary a lot, but it looks like in 2021 we will globally have a shortage of on the order of 2 to 3 million unfilled jobs in information security. So with that as a starting point, the first thing I'd suggest I'd like to see as the next big thing in security is more success in diversity hiring, because there's an untapped workforce out there that could help us fill those spots. And I'd like to point out too that information security is not all about hacking and nerdy, funny little solutions deep buried inside a technology stack. For people who want to be that kind of nerdy pen tester, which is a lot of fun, we certainly have those jobs, but information security is a lot broader than that. It involves physical security of buildings, it involves legal questions about contracts and privacy. There's a lot of work at many levels in an organization to coordinate work and bring people together. I end up talking to software development teams, executive leadership, operational infrastructure teams, professional services, and sales. I mean, this is not a bad job for a liberal arts major, which is actually what I am. And very few people, including myself, have thoroughly mastered all facets of it. The point being that there are ample opportunities in many, many ways to be useful in this field. And many people should be able to find their way in if we can make that possible for them. So there are things we should do on our side, and I'd be happy to talk about that if anyone wants to ask. But since we're short on time, I'll stop with that on my first answer. I did have one other answer. The other big thing I'd like to see in security is what the well-known computer security blogger and author Bruce Schneier calls more public interest technologists, which he defines as people who are working on a tech project that has social value, or for a tech company with a public benefit, or who are working on tech policy. Technology applied to social problems is something we don't have enough of. There aren't enough people doing it, there aren't enough people who know it needs to be done, and there aren't enough places to do it. And I'm quoting Bruce Schneier with that. So examples would be finding ways to build products or use technology perhaps to help immigrants with bureaucratic and legal process, to help unemployed people learn new skills, or to bring technology expertise into public policy. Our elected officials need help with subjects like encryption, voting machines, vulnerability disclosure policies. People with technology interest could be contributing by joining think tanks and lobbies. So that would be my other answer: diversity and public interest technology.
Well, Brian, I really appreciate that capstone. It couldn't have come more appropriately for those of us that work in the government sector to have you identify the next big thing as possibly involvement of folks that are not traditionally in IT. And I think as technology become an integral part of most enterprises, and the need to transform enterprises being closely related to application of technology, but of course without losing sight of business needs and general interests of the user community, and then in the case of the public sector, of course, the citizens at large. That is a very nice capstone. And with this said, I'd like to extend my thanks one more time to our panelists. They've given us some very interesting thoughts in a variety of different areas of information security. Once again, I want to remind all of you to consider attending PNSQC in Portland. Take advantage of the early bird rates if you can. And then, of course, where organization have more than 4 or more people, be sure to ask for the group discount. And we look forward to seeing all of you at this year's PNSQC in October 14th through the 16th. And please come to our inaugural Enterprise IT Quality Forum. And those panelists that are helping us today in discussing security, possibly once again, they would be involved in leading some discussions that are information security related, but also in other exciting areas of IT quality, including, but not necessarily limited to Agile, DevOps, and other interesting areas of current interests. With that said, the hour's up, and thank you once again for participating. Have a nice rest of the day. Goodbye.